Hall & Wilcox acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today.
Welcome back to our Hall & Wilcox Spotlight on Construction podcast series, in which we examine topics that affect the construction sector. My name is Sam Kelsey, and I'm a Senior Associate in the construction team at Hall & Wilcox. This is the first of two podcasts in which we're looking at green construction, by which we mean sustainable and environmentally friendly construction, with a particular focus on carbon emissions. In this first episode, we're going to look at carbon emissions from a developer's point of view. What are they? How are they measured? What can you do to reduce it? And why should you? I'm delighted today to be joined by Julia Hullowa, an associate at the Footprint Company, who specialises in sustainability and carbon advisory. Julia has been involved in a wide range of Australian and international projects, including buildings, transport, and new master plan communities. Her role focuses on leading and delivering new sustainability targets across developments and at a corporate level. Prior to joining the Footprint Company, Julia worked as a senior sustainability advisor at Frasers Property Australia, and before that as a sustainability consultant for Arup UK. Welcome, Julia. So I think to get started, a perhaps obvious question, Julia, what are carbon emissions?
Thank you very much, Sam. Carbon emission are the results of burning fossil fuels such as coal, natural gas, and oil, and they are present naturally into our atmosphere, and they do help to regulate the temperature. So they help to retain the heat from the sun, which is regulating our climate. As we are burning more and more fossil fuels, so due to increased energy demand and human activities, there is an increased level of carbon dioxide or carbon emission into the atmosphere, and as a result, we retain more heat, and this is what is producing climate change. And it's not just having hotter day; it's also about just changing in the climate in general.
Okay. So obviously Australia signed up to some pretty stringent obligations and commitments to reduce its carbon emissions. So how are carbon emissions measured? How do we work out whether we're reducing them or increasing them? Is there sort of a international accepted measurement tool, or I think Australia's probably ranked fairly low from when I last saw, but just interesting to hear, how do we even measure this in the atmosphere?
Yeah, so at corporate level, there is a standard called the Greenhouse Gas Emission Protocol, but then there is more detailed standards that exist for measuring carbon emission on buildings or infrastructure, and that may vary from one country to another. And there is also an international standard called the Science-Based Target Initiative, which provides some guidelines to industry on how much they should be reducing their carbon emission to hit the 1.5 degree Paris Agreement target. And it is very challenging. The way to measure it is that we look at how much fossil fuel is used, but not just directly by the company, also indirectly in their emission, but also in their supply chain. It's divided into three categories, which are called scopes, so scope 1, 2, and 3. Which I will describe briefly. So scope 1 is the fuel that is burned directly by a company. So for example, the natural gas used in a building for heating and cooling, or it can be a company corporate vehicle as well. It can be refrigerant leakage as well into buildings or things like that. Then there is scope 2, which are indirect emissions. So it is the one that are linked to the use of electricity. So it's any electricity that is purchased by the company for the use of their operation and buildings that they would own. And finally, there is scope 3, which is the biggest one for a lot of people, but also the least measured, unfortunately. And there is a trend in the industry to measure definitely more and more Scope 3. And it is everything that the company has impact on as part of their upstream emission, so all of the supply chain emission, as well as downstream, which is every product and services that the company procure. So as an example, the upstream emission will be all the materials that are procured, not just for the company, but also to build buildings and infrastructure, as well as services. And the downstream one would be things that the company sell, for example. So if they sell a property, it will be all the carbon emission associated with this property until end of life. So they became really, really big. And also it would include things like emissions from your tenants, that because it is you're renting a building to them. The Scope 3 emission may overlap, with manufacturers, builders, your tenants. But the key element here is if you have a level of influence and control and you can make an improvement, then it should be part of your boundary as well.
Okay. So taking perhaps a somewhat simple example for the construction sector, concrete and steel used in an abundance in every construction project, a category or Scope 3 carbon emission would be the carbon that is produced from manufacturing that concrete and manufacturing that steel. And that is both from the manufacturing facility, but also then the contractor or the developer that uses that carbon in the building. And what you're sort of saying in terms of overlap is, yes, we look at the carbon that the actual manufacturing plant produces in making the concrete. But if you as the developer or contractor are purchasing that concrete, you have a role to play in sort of being accountable for that carbon that has been produced in that sort of environment.
Yeah, exactly. And the things to be aware of as well is that the property industry has a very large carbon emission. So buildings and infrastructure account for about 37 to 40% of carbon emission worldwide. So we have a really big role to play. About the 2/3 of it is linked to the energy use from the buildings. But we anticipate that this will reduce as there is more and more renewable in Australia that are being developed, and the government has ambitious what we call decarbonization targets for the electricity grid. But at the moment, the steel and concrete and material in the building still represents almost 10%, 1/3 of the property carbon emissions.
Okay.
And they're going to obviously increase as there is more and more building being built, but also as the green decarbonize, you will have a bigger share.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we're in a period of time at the moment where on one hand we have a government who's committed to reducing our carbon footprint, at the same time as we've got a government who's going on a massive infrastructure and residential housing spending spree effectively. Those two things just naturally don't necessarily sit hand in hand unless all the new infrastructure you're building and all the new houses you're building are built in the most carbon efficient way. You can't build all that infrastructure and housing at the same time as reducing carbon emissions if you don't take account of this. So I think it's an interesting time, and at the moment I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on people in the construction sector to really start thinking about how they are building in the most carbon friendly way. We've seen carbon reporting draft legislation come out, and I think it's definitely a focus the government's had. So looking at this specifically from a developer's point of view, and we'll look at contractors separately in our next episode, as a developer, what can I do? What are some of the easy steps I can take to start reducing my carbon emissions?
So the most commonly known one would be reducing the energy use, both in existing assets that they may own or new ones that they are developing. The second one that has been a trend for quite a few years already is electrification, so removing gas from in the new building, so that they only rely on electricity, which is becoming more and more green, I would say, from renewable energy. But also electrifying old buildings. So as the equipment is reaching its end of life for things like hot water or heating and cooling, there are options to replace with all electric equipment. And we can see, for example, that the ACD government has been quite proactive with this. And for example, for the properties that they lease, they require them to transition to all electric. And even in the residential sector, when you may think, oh, people love to have, their gas cooktops, it is safer to have induction cooktop, both in terms of air quality. There is no emission of gas in the home, but also in terms of it's not hot. When you touch it, it only hits your pan. And finally, it's much easier to clean. So that makes sense. So that's more for the energy aspect of it. Then there is a need to also shift and really look at the carbon emission associated with materials, which are called embodied carbon. And this is about understanding, measuring it, understanding your supply chain, but also working throughout the design process to reduce the amount of material in the first place, because this is how you reduce carbon emission as well. It doesn't have to be more expensive. Using less is the most efficient way of reducing carbon. And working with what already exists, such as refurbishing existing building, having space that can have multi-usage, but also looking then as efficiency in the design to reduce material use, and finally looking at low carbon materials, so engaging with supply chain and manufacturers.
I'd seen this sort of a philosophy around a little bit for the developer's design stage to think about, I think the phrase is build nothing, build less. When you're looking at building a new building, have a look and see what's already out there, and it's not necessarily just taking a building that exists and just refitting it out or refurbishing it. What of that building, even if you demolish the whole building, there's material left behind from that demolishing, and there's obviously contamination issues we need to contend with, but a philosophy of, well, if I'm going to knock down that 10-story building because I want that site to put a 50-story residential tower of, what of the demolished building materials can I use again? So that sort of practice would necessarily reduce carbon emissions, because you're not having to make more concrete and make more steel if there's already products there that you can use. Have you seen much practice of that in Australia?
Yes, it is starting, and now we can see more and more building doing refurbishment, and looking at how much they're actually saving from doing this initiative, and communicating about the benefits of it, and also being rewarded. So, for example, Quarter K in Sydney has reused a significant portion of the core and existing upper superstructure elements. So that was a very good story for this project, especially for a building of this scale. But then there are a lot of people doing refurbishment that are probably not shutting out as much, but maybe they should, because this is definitely best practice to reduce carbon emissions.
Do you think there's perhaps a bit of a misconception out there that when people think of green construction, they automatically see dollar signs and just assume it's going to cost them more money and it's cheaper just to keep doing what they're doing and shipping the concrete and the steel from sort of, I think China's the main place we get most of these materials from. Do you think there's a bit of an education piece needed in terms of, just because it's green construction, it's not necessarily going to cost you more money? And even if it's a little bit more money to start with over the lifetime of the project, it doesn't make much financial difference to you? Do you think there's enough out there about the actual cost benefits of this?
Absolutely. And I think the misconception is sometimes sustainability we try to make it happen toward the end of the project, saying, oh, we have to do something about sustainability. But because a lot of the design has been done already, there is much less opportunities, and then it became more expensive to either change things or swap one equipment for another or one material for another. But if it's considered early on or even at strategic level for like a company, they can have a much more impact for much lower costs. And there are opportunity to streamline as well initiative across their portfolio for some of them.
So early thinking, early action
Absolutely.
is the key. And maybe just to sort of wrap up this topic today, I think perhaps cynically, maybe people are sort of think, why should I? What's in it for me? Why should I do this? Until the point where I'm forced to do it by the government. Why should I? What's the benefit to me as a developer?
Yeah, so we absolutely recommend developers to start measuring their carbon emission so that they can really identify where are the main source of emission and focus on these ones, and make a bit of a plan on how they're going to reduce it. This also prevents the risk of greenwashing, where people or businesses make claims around, I will reduce carbon emission by this much, but they don't have a plan in place. Or they are very vocal about small initiatives that they're doing, but they don't have a good overview of the big picture and what their actual emissions are. So I think, at the first point, absolutely measuring, understanding how much we're talking about and where the focus should be put on. But there are a lot of added value, such as, for example, there are more and more investors interested in linking green loans to carbon emission reporting. So that can open the door to better finance. There is also upcoming reportings for carbon emission for the larger businesses. So it is good to start early on so that business can get ready for the reporting, and also make sure that they have a plan in place to reduce it.
Yeah, I think we've already seen a few prosecutions coming out for greenwashing. So, we would always say it's better to be ahead of the game than racing to catch up. So, well, thanks so much, Julia. That's been really interesting. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your insights on this. And thanks everyone for listening. As always, please get in touch with us if you have any questions. Our contact details are on our website, hallandwilcox.com.au, and you can always connect with us and Julia on LinkedIn. In our next episode, we're going to be discussing this same topic of green construction again, but from a contractor's perspective, so a lot more about materials and the construction process. We're going to be joined by Julia again, who's going to share her thoughts and insights on this topic. If you've enjoyed today's episode, then rate, review, or follow our podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you for listening.
This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.